All right, kind enough to give us a couple minutes here on the program, representing New York's 10th District, Representative Dan Goldman. Mr. Goldman, Mike Leon, Nick Severi, thank you so much for hopping on the program with us.
Great to be with you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's so funny because we were trying to have you on a couple weeks ago, and obviously things have changed a little bit in this country. We wanted you to come on and talk about President Biden atop the Democratic ticket. The convention's coming up in August. We're going to get into some of that in a second, but I did want to start first with the events of what happened last week, because I know there was recently an announcement that the House is going to call the director of the Secret Service to, talk about what went wrong on Saturday from that perspective. And I know the investigation is ongoing, but just for you at the 30,000 foot overview, the former president of the United States, an attempt on his life. What did you make of not only what happened Saturday, but now as we get into the investigation phase and we find out a little bit more about the shooter and how he was able to get access with something so secure, you would think, of an outdoor venue? What do you make of it all?
Well, look, the whole thing is incredibly horrifying and very unsettling for everyone in this country, and obviously Donald Trump at the top of that list. I was shocked and really, really upset about this attempted assassination at him. And I disagree with him on just about every issue, policy, and governmental civics otherwise, but would never, ever want any harm to anybody. And I think it is a reflection of how in jeopardy and how precarious our democracy is right now that we don't yet know the motive, but certainly a candidate for president had an attempted assassination. And there's no question we need to look into how this gunman got such close access and a sight line within or without the security perimeter, and what the coordination was. And I know I sit on the oversight committee, and I fully expect that we will look into that. But there's a much bigger and I think broader issue here, which is not only our political discourse, but the epidemic of gun violence and the ease of access to a semi-automatic weapon for a 20-year-old who's clearly not well, whether it's clinically diagnosed or not. Anyone who is going to attempt to assassinate a president knowing that he's likely risking his own life is not all there. And it highlights how important gun safety legislation is. And I really hope that one silver lining to this horrific incident is that we can start to have a serious conversation with my Republican colleagues about just very basic gun safety legislation, background checks, universal red flag laws, safe storage so that this person can't get access to a gun, an AR-15 like that. These don't take guns away from people. They just make sure that those who have them are competent and qualified to have them so that we have fewer mass shootings than we do. And we're up to almost 2 per day now in this country.
Totally agree on that number. And with respect to what gun legislation, we've had other members of Congress talking about that. Sensible gun laws is something that should make sense and every American should be on. I did want to ask you just a follow up to that because, and I've been making the TV punditry rounds, you get asked about the events of Saturday and and President Biden said this from the Oval Office, it's lowering of the temperature in terms of rhetoric. Now, I want to make a caveat here to you because I don't agree with some of the vitriol that's being aimed your way because there's a lack of self-awareness from the other side of the political aisle with respect to the way they've poo-pooed or, made light of different events that have incited violence, right? So with that, though, I do want to ask you, because obviously everyone's been playing this clip of when you were on MSNBC with Jen Psaki, and you were talking about the threat that the former president faces, right? How do you craft a message now? Because it's making the rounds, on social media. How do you craft a message to say that, look, the threat in terms of what we're facing in November is a choice at the ballot box between this party's philosophy and that party's philosophy? And then what do you make of how do we lower the temperature? Because I just mentioned the lack of self-awareness that is involved in all of this. And we're seeing other members of Congress immediately in the aftermath of this shooting blaming Democrats and blaming President Biden for this. That's not lowering the temperature. So how do we make sense of all of this, and how do we go forward from here, Congressman?
Well, absolutely. And I'm glad you raised it. I think you're referring to a clip a number of months ago where I misspoke, and I made that very clear right after the interview and used the word that Donald Trump should be eliminated when I intended and meant to say defeated. I certainly have always condemned and will always condemn any kind of political violence, as has President Biden. And when I say that as a misspoken word, I think it is clear and should be clear to everyone, as for me at least, someone who was a former prosecutor, believes so strongly in our democracy and the rule of law, that I'm not calling for any political violence. I'm calling for Donald Trump to be beaten and defeated at the ballot box in November. And that's the exact same thing that Joe Biden has always said. The problem we run into is, as you can see from the Republicans who have been so eager to project their own misconduct and inappropriate rhetoric on Democrats. I sit on the weaponization committee of the federal government, the subcommittee that Jim Jordan created, which is a joke, trying to accuse President Biden of weaponizing the government when you look back at Donald Trump and the way that he declassified in intelligence information for political purposes, the way that he intervened in his friends' cases within the Department of Justice, the way that he pardoned more than 10% of his pardons were, associates and friends of his. And it's the same kind of thing. Their rhetoric has been really extreme. I mean, dating long back to 2018, when the pipe bomber, if you may remember, sent pipe bombs to President Obama and Secretary Clinton and 15 other people because he admitted that he was radicalized by Donald Trump. And of course, January 6th is the quintessential example of rhetoric used knowingly to incite violence. And so I do hope that my Republican colleagues will take the tenor down. I'll certainly be more conscious of it myself because I don't want my words to be taken out of context. It's, of course, not what I meant. But the notion that within an hour of this event, J.D. Vance, now the vice presidential candidate, jumps on Twitter and starts attacking Joe Biden and Democrats as if that he called for an assassination attempt without knowing anything about who the shooter is or any of the context is really irresponsible, and it's really dangerous. And we still don't know very much about the shooter other than he was a registered Republican. And his classmates say that he was a staunch conservative and there were Trump signs in front of his house. We know very little, but it certainly is not from at this point someone who was especially politically involved either. So there's a lot that remains to be seen, and I would advise my colleagues to reserve judgment until we know more.
To that end, Representative Goldman, obviously the RNC takes place this week. The Democrats get their shot, obviously coming up. From the standpoint of temperature and messaging, what are some of the hopeful outcomes you have about how Democrats put forward their message when they take the stage soon?
Well, look, I think the pick of J.D. Vance for vice president says everything that you need to know. He is so extreme. He's inexperienced, but he believes that there should be no abortion and no exception for rape or incest. He has said that he would not have certified the last election and has made it very clear that he will not guarantee to certify the next election. He's a strong proponent of Trump's Project 2025, which will completely dismantle our government as we know it. This was a pick by Donald Trump to double down on MAGA extremism. And rather than pick someone a little bit more moderate, someone who has more experience governing, more experience in the Senate, who has been perhaps a chair or ranking member of a committee and has passed legislation. No, he picks the most extreme candidate that he could. And so there's going to be a lot for us to talk about to juxtapose our candidate with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. I've heard people say, oh, okay, Donald Trump's going to be the good cop now. Anytime Donald Trump is a good cop in a good cop, bad cop situation, we're in big trouble.
Very, it's very funny. I did want to ask you because the original reason why we had reached out and we had been communicating to have you on the program was in the aftermath of the debate and what we've seen over the last couple of weeks from President Biden in different interviews on ABC News and NBC News, and I'm sure you've been vocal about this. I think you have across the media outlets, but I would love to get your perspective here because the DNC, as to Nick's point, is coming up in just a month. We're recording right now on the week of the RNC convention. So the DNC is coming up in a month. There's infighting. There's some members of Congress that have said President Biden needs to step aside, including friend of the show, Representative Seth Moulton, who's been on this program a few times. So I'm curious, first from your perspective, with respect to that, is that past us, or is this still something that's being discussed in the House and Senate Democrats? And then if it's still being discussed, where do we go from here? But if it's not being discussed, what is the rallying message that should be front and foremost in terms of the last 3.5 years of President Biden's administration and the policies he's carried forth at the DNC convention coming up in August?
Well, Joe Biden has been a remarkable president. When you look at the legislation that he was able to pass, especially his first 2 years in office when Democrats had the majority in both the Senate and the House, it's historic. I mean, there were historic investments in infrastructure, historic investments in manufacturing and bringing it back to the United States, historic investments in subsidies for building the green economy, creating jobs, becoming energy independent. We had the first bipartisan gun safety legislation in 30 years. The list goes on, but lowering prescription drug prices significantly, maxing out insulin at $35 a month. These are things that really impact the middle class, the lower class, and helps to build that economy from, as he says, the bottom up and the middle out. In this second 2 years, he has showed such an incredible, steady, knowledgeable, wise leadership on the international stage. After Donald Trump had effectively destroyed our relationships with our allies, President Biden rallied all of our allies ahead of Vladimir Putin's illegal, unjust invasion of a democratic country that neighbors his own. And there was tremendous widespread global support for Ukraine. And the Middle East situation is the most complex geopolitical situation that there is. President Biden has done a terrific job of staying the course, making sure that we're supporting our democratic ally in Israel, but also doing everything that we can to end this conflict so that we can get the Palestinian civilians back on their feet. That's a really remarkable record. And I think what people are questioning right now is, can we see what he has done over the last 3.5 years for the next 4 years? And there's no question that we didn't see it at the debate. The debate was really bad. And it was sort of shocking to the extent to which I've certainly never seen President Biden like that. And so I think the conversations that Democrats are having is, as Nancy Pelosi says, was that an episode or is it a condition? And if it was an episode, that we need to really see him and see him out there meeting with constituents, having interviews, talking to voters, and doing it in an unscripted, off-the-cuff way so that we know that however old he is, 3 years older than Donald Trump, that he is with it and that he can be the leader that we need and that he has demonstrated to be. And now it's a kind of an interesting question because on the other side, putting aside all of Donald Trump's faults, his criminal charges, his impeachments, his, lies, his attacks on the rule of law, his destabilization of our democracy, he's also 78 years old. And J.D. Vance is a 39-year-old political neophyte. So that's now going to be a consideration as well. But I think what we are looking for, and everybody is focused on it, is making sure that the Joe Biden that has created that record for the last 3.5 years is the Joe Biden that we're going to be voting for in November.
Representative, part of this conversation, obviously having you today, in the presence of a member of Congress, right? But I want to appeal to you for a moment as an attorney. So recently you posted, and this news just broke recently, about the documents case, out of Florida involving the former president. And you had rightfully brought up just the oddness of that decision. Could you just take us through a legal lens as to how that decision gets made? Now, for obviously our listeners, the case was being dismissed because it was ruled unconstitutional for Jack Smith to be appointed. Make of that what you wish to, but yeah, Representative Goldman, if you don't mind just taking us through sort of the from a legal analysis, what feels sound, more likely unsound about that decision, and just your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at it from a broader perspective first, and then drill down on some of the details, um, you really crystallize right now what is on the ballot in November. And it is not just what we talk about in terms of the rule of law and our governing abilities, the Department of Education, which Trump wants to wipe away. He wants to get rid of any reference to climate change. He wants to make all civil servants, or the majority of supervisory civil servants, political loyalists, and the list goes on. Get rid of medication abortion. We could go on. It's a 920-page document. But what's really scary is how that is lining up with what's going on in the judiciary. And so you have a Trump-packed Supreme Court that just ruled that he has absolute immunity for any act that could be considered official act while he is president, including any conversations that he has with any executive agency, including the attorney general, if he were to say, go after my political opponents and arrest them, that cannot be used either as evidence or as chargeable conduct. So he's now protected based on what happens during his presidency. What the judge in Florida did yesterday was effectively manufacture the same kind of immunity out of whole cloth for conduct that occurred after he was president. And that judge was a judge appointed by Donald Trump at the end of his term. And so there's a consistency and a continuity here, which is that no longer does it appear as if the judiciary is truly a check and balance on executive power, on our separation of powers, on the rule of law, but the judiciary is participating in Donald Trump's efforts to tear down our democracy. And so that is on the ballot. And the reason why I say that as it relates to the Judge Cannon opinion is that this was raised in the Robert Mueller special counsel's situation. He was a private citizen and was appointed to be a special counsel. And it went all the way up to the DC Circuit, which in the appellate level is the most persuasive and significant appeals court below the Supreme Court. And that DC Circuit ruled that it was perfectly valid. You now have a rogue Trump-appointed district judge in Florida who rules against the most esteemed court of appeals in the country. And there are other instances of many occasions when the special counsel, as it is structured right now, which changed in 2000, 2001 maybe, the structure was approved and ratified by various different courts. And so you have someone who already was strongly rebuked for the way she handled the search warrant at Mar-a-Lago, which went way overboard in favor of Donald Trump, and the circuit court overruled her there. And now she's doing something else that's completely off base and outside, the fairway of what any judge would ordinarily do, designed again to protect Donald Trump. And so it will be appealed. I expect that it will be overturned, but unquestionably it will now delay the case well into 2025, and is really a reflection of how the Trump-appointed judges and the sort of far-right legal ecosphere is trying to change our law because of this rogue, extreme, conservative Supreme Court that Donald Trump has packed and added to two other justices, Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito, who have conflicts of interest right, left, and center, but continue to violate their ethics obligations and rule on these cases.
Representative Goldman, before we let you go, and can't thank you enough for hopping on the program with us today, but I did want to ask, because Nick always likes to ask this question, so I'm going to steal it from him, about your constituents, of which, I'm a New York City kid, born and raised, East Bronx kid, I obviously lived in Manhattan for a long, long time. What are you hearing from your constituents right now as we get into these summer months coming up and we're going to head into the fall for an election year? Are some of the things that you're hearing from New York's 10th congressional district and the folks that are living there?
Well, I hear a mix. Many constituents are obviously and understandably really just concerned about how they are going to pay their rent and put food on the table and pay for their health care. And if, God forbid, there were some surprising or unexpected accident that was going to cost money, where would that come from? Rents in New York are at an all-time high. We have a housing shortage, and that's true across the country. And there's just insufficient support for working Americans to be able to get access to the American dream, which is what everyone deserves in this country. So there are a lot of people who are focused on that, who are focused. I'll give you one sort of detailed example on the Affordable Connectivity Program, which you may not be familiar with, but it is a program that provides free wireless internet, essentially, for those who qualify and are under a particular poverty level, that the Republicans allowed to lapse. I hear about that all the time because that is something everybody needs, and they can't afford to pay for it on top of everything else. On the flip side, what I hear about on the national stage is real fear. There's a real fear of what Donald Trump intends to do. And you don't have to read his mind because he is very open about wanting to be a dictator, about going after his enemies, about undermining our government for his personal benefit. And people are really afraid of what is going to become of this country if Donald Trump wins the presidency.
Congressman Dan Goldman, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program today. Continued success to you, sir. Please stay safe.
Thanks for having me, guys. Great to be with you.